Hi guys, in today's Wisdom Wednesday I'm going to be talking about another topic where we typically apply an adult model to children and think we're going to have the same results, and that is speed training for the youth athlete. And there's several reasons why the adult model and the child's model are going to look slightly different, which I'm going to get started with in this presentation. So firstly, we're going to talk about why maturation matters. So this is the stage or how biologically old that a child is. Next, we're going to talk about what fundamentals you should be looking for in your youth athletes and what these actually are. And finally, I'm going to discuss my 4P framework for developing speed and telling you which areas of your speed training you should be prioritizing at any given time. So I'd argue that this is more like a pie chart rather than a pyramid, i.e. you're not just going to solely do positional work and then you move on to pattern and then you move on to power, but I do like a pyramid for conceptualizing it, and it also allows me to sneak my logo into the PowerPoint. So let's get into it. So why does maturation matter? Well, firstly, maturation is simply a reflection of how biologically old a child is. Now, if you've ever worked with, say, a bunch of 14-year-olds, you might have some who are biologically 18 and are basically fully grown men, whilst others are biologically 12 and are yet to hit their growth spurt. The reason why this matters is because the mechanisms at which children develop speed and strength are slightly different depending on their stage of maturation. Now, when children go through their most accelerated period of growth, also known as their growth spurt, they're going to have an increase in hormonal profile, especially male athletes going through puberty, and this hormonal profile is what is going to support increases in muscle mass, which will then see increases in strength and will typically be associated with increases in speed. Any increases in strength prior to the growth spurt are typically going to be neurological. So what I mean by that is your athlete is simply improving their ability to coordinate a movement. They haven't actually increased muscle mass or muscle size. So the analogy I like to give is, when we think about coordination and also the growth spurt, is if you imagine a corner shop and how efficient they're going to be at getting their employees to do certain tasks, and then, for example, that's pre-peak height velocity or pre-growth spurt. And if you imagine a major franchise like Tesco and how easily they're able to mobilize employees just simply because they've got more of them, that is pre-peak height velocity with your corner shop and your small number of employees, versus post or circa PHV or peak height velocity when you've got a load of muscle or motor units or employees in Tesco's case to be able to complete a task. So before puberty, we're not very well coordinated, we haven't got many motor units to access. However, after puberty, we have an increase in hormones, an increase in muscle mass, so an increase in motor units that can do that job for us. So prior to peak height velocity, any improvements in speed or strength are going to be down to improved coordination. Whereas when we're going through our peak height velocity, or we've got athletes going through their peak height velocity, they will get hormonal induced strength changes. Now, you might find that during the growth spurt, as kids get heavier, their limbs grow longer, you might find that their coordination is thrown out the window and you almost need to go back and revisit some basic fundamental movement patterns. If that happens, don't worry about load, don't worry about intensity, just get that coordination looking smooth, and don't assume just because you taught it to them a few years ago that it's not going to go out the window when limbs get longer and the body gets heavier. So post peak high velocity, they're out of their most accelerated period of growth. At this point in time, it's really great if you've built a foundation of coordination and strength, and these athletes will continue to get stronger because of these increases in hormones, particularly testosterone in male athletes. Now, female athletes, again, are still going to experience increases in speed and strength after they've gone through their growth spurt. However, it might not be as pronounced as it is in male athletes. Up until male and female athletes go through puberty, they're biologically basically the same, and there's no reason why, for example, a prepubertal female athlete couldn't be just as strong or just as quick as a prepubertal male athlete. However, the difference between the two certainly does become more stark as they go through puberty. So the next thing I want to talk about is slowing down to speed up. So the analogy that I heard from a coach called Fitzgibbon, who I interviewed in one of my episodes of the Platform to Perform podcast, is if you had a child who kept pressing their foot on the brakes when they were trying to ride a bike and you wanted them to go faster, would you get them to pedal harder or stop having their foot or their hand on the brake? Logically, obviously, you take their hand off the brake. However, a lot of kids' movement patterns are so uncoordinated, they are effectively putting the brakes on whenever they try and sprint. So what I mean by saying slowing down in order to speed up, if we go back a couple of steps, take those brakes off, clean up the coordination patterns that may be getting in the way of speed training, and making sure they can squat, making sure they can lunge, making sure they can perform an effective hip hinge pattern, that's us taking the brakes off. Once we've got those patterns down, then you're going to start to see improvements in speed, even if you literally did no speed work whatsoever. So by taking the brakes off, we can get rid of the speed errors that will slow us down. So for example, athletes like the athlete in the bottom right, who is recovering his heel very poorly, and he's then going to strike on his heels when he's trying to sprint, or the athlete in the top right who's using very little of his arms. And then you've also got classic errors such as over rotation. So we want to make sure we are building both the brakes and the accelerators. So we're learning coordination, which is going to stop us keeping our own handbrake on. We're also developing the ability to brake, so the ability to slow down, the ability to decelerate, and the ability to land, as well as building up the ability to accelerate. A lot of this can be gamified. I quite like involving, for example, if you're doing a game and a team concedes, then you might make them do a couple of squats, not as a punishment, but just as a disguised way of making it fun and including those patterns. So fundamentals. I emphasize the word fun because at young age we shouldn't be technically drilling athletes. We can almost do what I call a progression through play pathway. So we're disguising movement literacy into games. We've got an idea of what patterns we're trying to improve, and we're gradually going to make them harder, but almost without the athlete knowing. I've got plenty of these examples on Calisthenics Kids, which is another Patreon content that I have put out there. So fundamentals first, I want the brakes and the pedals to be working as well as they can. An athlete who's coordinated, who can jump, stop, hop, land, and actually accelerate from lower body positions, but we're gamifying it. So we're going to develop them both simultaneously. And this leads nicely into my 4P framework for speed. So my foundation, if you will, is can they get in the right position? So do they have the mobility and stability to get into the correct positions at slow speeds? So even if you take your athletes through something as simple as an A march, or even if they're doing a slow skip, can they get the left side of the body and the right side of the body to do things independently? Can they get the brain talking to the hands and the feet at the same time? If they can go through, for example, A marches, even squats, lunges, hip hinges, they're developing low levels of coordination with their body, and they are showing you they've got the mobility and stability to hit certain positions, which will be more important when they sprint. So if we've got that at slow speeds, then obviously we want to add a little bit of rhythm to it. What you'll probably find with kids is that they're very good at going fast, or as I like to call it, cheetah speed, and they're very good at going slow, but there's not much in between. They struggle to dial it back a little bit. A good way for teaching rhythm, something I picked up from Howard Green, is skipping with a metronome, and you just dial that up and dial that back down. So the pattern is, can they move with some element of rhythm? A skips are great here, B skips are great here. Even chucking a skipping rope in your warm-up is going to reap a lot of benefits, and certainly more than if you're simply getting kids to jog laps, which for me, not a fan of. So once we can hit positions at slow speeds and we can hit these positions with some kind of rhythm, then we're going to start to worry about developing power. Because if we develop a load of power, and let's say we stick, for example, if you've got a car that can go from 0 to 60 in half a second, then it's not very useful if you give it to somebody who doesn't know how to steer it. That's the analogy I would use if you're concerning yourself with strength and power, but actually you've got athletes who aren't very well coordinated. So once we get into the power stuff, we're starting to look at jumps, we're starting to look at hops, we're starting to look at maybe even some light sled work or even acceleration work. As I said, just because I've presented the framework in this way does not mean that you are not doing any kind of power work until you've done position and pattern to start work. It's just simply to say where the priority should lie, and in the coming slide I'm going to reveal a little flowchart I use for deciding where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time with youth athletes. If you've got someone with rhythm and who can coordinate the positions at speed, then if you get them more powerful, you're now effectively giving a greater engine or more gears in the car to someone who actually knows how to steer it. And finally, progression. I'm going to touch upon this in a second, but progression for me is simply either the ability to do more of it, but remember, you cannot endure a quality that you do not have. So if you're doing repeated sprint sessions with your athletes and you haven't taught them how to sprint correctly, they're not magically going to learn when they're tired. Speed work is great when it's done fresh. It just turns into conditioning and gets sloppy when we do it under fatigue. So this is where you need to be clever as a coach. In another video, I've mentioned about how balance can improve speed in youth athletes with a low training age. And balance work or disguised balance games is great for sneaking in between repetitions of pure speed work, because kids, one, they don't think that it's rest because there still seems like they're doing something, but two, it's also non-fatiguing enough where kids can still get faster because you're giving them the full rest period to recover. So here's the framework that I mentioned. So firstly, can your youth athletes demonstrate quality movement patterns in squatting, hip bending and lunging? I'd probably also chuck in bracing or the ability to hold a push-up position in plank as well into this mix, because if they can't do that, there's no point trying to get them to coordinate even something like an A skip or a B skip, because it's going to be too much for them to handle. So if they can't do all of those things, then we need to get them squatting, lunging and bending their hips without looking like they're going to curve their spine. This is also great because basically it's sort of more global coordination, and also when we start getting into refined stuff with a bit of rhythm, so A skips, B skips, it's going to make that a darn sight easier. Also, if you think about it, the mobility and stability needed in these patterns is going to develop mobility and stability in the areas that matter when we speed things up. So if they can demonstrate effective squatting, hip bending and lunging patterns, then we're going to see if we can add a little bit of rhythm to it, so a little bit of speed. So basic skipping patterns, getting the left side of the body and the right side of the body to work independently, A skips, B skips and jumping rope with that metronome, as I've already mentioned. So if they can demonstrate rhythm in these types of tasks, then if they can't, we're prioritizing global coordination. So anything that's getting them to work at different speeds, maybe different tempos, and just increasing the stimulus to the central nervous system. So there's several ways you can do this. You can, for example, play about with sound. You can play about with them responding to seeing something. You can give them a movement pattern and see how well they can copy it. And typically athletes who can see something and copy it straight away probably don't have problems with global coordination. But again, gamify it where you can so it doesn't turn into a Simon Says scenario. So if they have got that coordination down, then the next question I'm going to ask is about maturation status. So have they gone through their most accelerated period of growth? Now, if you're not taking measurements, that's fine. This can be problematic if you're in a school or maybe you just don't have the time. But if your athletes haven't gone through their most accelerated period of growth, or sorry, if they have, then we're going to complement our speed and power work with chase games. Chase games are still going to be where we're going to develop the bulk of our speed because you're going to get the intent. However, if they are not pre-PHV, so let's say they've gone through their most accelerated growth spurt, then we can prioritize sprint mechanics works if it's appropriate, because the kids we're working with might have the concentration abilities to deal with this. However, this is very much a case-by-case basis, and if athletes' concentration isn't there, that's not their fault. As a coach, it's your job to adapt to it, and gamify it where you can. If they are pre-PHV or pre-peak height velocity, pre-growth spurt, you're going to complement their coordination work with stuff like chase games to drive that intent. So a word on progression. So as I said, what might come after we've got an athlete who can move, develop mobility, stability, do this at speed, and with some element of coordination. Now, in an ideal world, this is where athletes or even kids should be after a comprehensive physical education program, if we're lucky, or at a reasonable stage towards the end of their long-term athletic development. So progression, this could be sport specific, dare I use the word, where we're starting to talk about what speed looks like within the context of their sport or their position. Equally, we also want to have been developing multi-directional speed at the same time. I'm going to save that for a separate video because that is content that deserves it. It's rare that we typically get athletes who get to this level where we can start talking about enduring speed or multi-directional speed. But the foundation of speed for kids anyway is always going to be coordination. You can get as strong as you want, which is 100% going to help you, but if kids can't develop that rhythm or don't have the ability to get to the brain, to talk to the hands and feet, you're going to struggle. If you've got kids who cannot coordinate a simple skipping pattern, which I've seen plenty of times, then there's no point getting them stronger and more powerful, because you're effectively doing what I mentioned earlier, where you're putting somebody who doesn't know how to steer a car behind a vehicle that can go 0 to 60 in half a second. So that's why I like the flowchart for telling us where we should prioritize most of our work. And again, I also think it's worth knowing that speed in the context of sport is going to involve some kind of perceptual stimuli, so reacting to opponents or a ball, and is typically going to involve transitional movements as well as scanning to see what's happening in the field of play. I would call this agility, and that's worth a video in itself. So as I said, linear speed, it's part of the puzzle, not the entire piece when it comes to agility. But I'm going to do a different video for that, because oftentimes what I see is people talking about agility is actually reinforcing bad habits, such as looking at the floor in a speed ladder, or doesn't take into context the fact that straight line speed is always going to be quicker than multi-directional speed, and that agility, or the purpose of agility, is effectively to get us into straight line running as effectively as possible. So as I said, progression is an all-encompassing term. It's relative to the athlete, can be relative to the sport, but by the time you get to this stage, major technical errors should have been cleaned up. Athletes should be familiar with the low body position involved in accelerating, and the taller position involved in max velocity work. So progression could simply mean we're extending the distance, could mean we're getting more repetitions in, it could even mean we're starting to include sport-specific stimuli. But as I said, that is for a different video. So I hope you've enjoyed this slightly longer video than what I anticipated. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me using my contact details, which are on the screen. And I hope you've enjoyed this Wisdom Wednesday. Catch you again in the next video.